that I took on my Alaska trip. Did I read this book on my Alaska trip? Well, given that it's November, and I'm just now reporting back. Hello, welcome, thank you for clicking on this video. If you're new here, hello, my name is Anne, and if you are not new, welcome back my friends. Today we have another book review video. So I thought it would be fun to compile the books that I read that were in a sort of seasonal theme into one video and we could talk about them together. So this was obviously September and October were of course spooky season vibes. November, I just wasn't ready to start Christmas books yet. So I still continue to read some of those fall vibe like thriller books. However, now that it is November, the end of November, we're going into December, next video will be Christmas books only. So be sure to subscribe if you would like to stay tuned for that because that is coming. I already have, I think, 3 books already that are on my list that I want to read, so that will be exciting. But without further ado, let's jump into the fall books I read. The first book that I read is called The Quarry Girls. It is by Jess Lourey, possibly Lourey, I'm not sure how to say her last name. If you watched the Alaska Pack with me back in like May, this is in fact the book that I took on my Alaska trip. Did I read this book on my Alaska trip? Well, given that it's November and I'm just now reporting back, I obviously did not. So I actually had somebody comment and say, hey, did you like the book? And I had to reply back, I hadn't read it. I did not read it on that trip. So I've read it now, y'all. So here are my thoughts on this book. Overall, I'm gonna rate this book 4 stars. Quick synopsis, this book takes place in like the late 70s. We have a main character, her name is Heather, and she is sort of growing apart from some of her other female friends. They're sort of growing up, becoming women, and she feels like she's left behind. There's also this like underlying feeling of anxiety within this town where she lives. The author actually goes into sort of a description and sort of a little mini story at the beginning of the book as far as like her childhood growing up. There had been a lot of unsolved murders, and so you sort of feel that leach into the setting of the story. So basically we have sort of a smaller town and girls slash young women are disappearing and nobody is really sure what's going on, what's happening. There's also sort of an overlying presence of, I want to say like very stereotypical gender roles throughout the story. Again, this is the late 70s, but it's very much like men are in power, women are the homemakers. This sort of like overall tension throughout the book as people kind of challenge these gender norms and gender roles. Essentially what happens is Heather and one of her friends see something that they shouldn't have seen and they start suspecting different people in the town. Like nobody is who they say they are. They feel like they can't trust anyone, and it's sort of just this like general ill at ease book, and Heather is trying to uncover what's going on and what's happening to these young women that are going missing, and kind of along the way we think that maybe she might be next. So it's a little bit scary, it's a little bit spooky, definitely a thriller. So my pros for this book were that the suspense overall in the novel was really good. Like even from the beginning, again with like reading that sort of footnote from the author about her growing up in this like creepy town, it sort of carries very well throughout the book. And honestly, like this place where it takes place is like, I think it's called like St. Cloud, Minnesota. I never want to go there. I will never, absolutely not. No thank you. So she does it, the author does this sort of scene setting very, very well, and throughout the entire book you're kind of just like feeling very like ill at ease as you read the book because you are really living in that suspense. One of the ways that she really does a great job of this is she writes very immersively. I wasn't alive in the late 70s, and so the way that she writes was so on brand for that time period that I had to look up several references, like different pop culture references that she was referring to, and different things like that, because I was like, I don't even understand what this is. And I think had I grown up in the 70s, or had I sort of understood some of those references, it would have been like, oh yeah, that of course. Like the way that she kind of weaves that into the writing, even as simple as the way that the character speaks or thinks, like her inner dialogue, it really makes you feel like you are in the late 70s along with this character. So I thought she did a really, really good job of that. At times it was almost frustrating because she was doing such a good job, and I just was like, let's get past the scene setting. Like, I'm so excited for the story to begin. But I get why she did that, because she wanted the reader to really feel immersed in the story. So my cons for this book were just that some of the pieces I feel like didn't really sit right with me as far as the way that things panned out. One of the really big ones for me was that the main character, again, she's young. She's, I think, like 13 or something. So she's definitely younger, maybe 15, but she's definitely younger. And she's definitely naive. But I think that there were definitely points in the story where she just felt very dense. There were things that were going on, particularly with her family, that I was like, girl, come on, like, it's screaming, like, I'm screaming at her, come on, how do you not realize this? So that was a little bit frustrating sometimes, perhaps because I have the perspective of an adult and I can very clearly see what's happening, and she was a child and she wasn't able to see that. But there were some pieces where I felt like the character was clinging so hard to her innocence, almost in the innocence of her family, that she refused to see what was right in front of her. And I did think that almost didn't feel very realistic, because I think at some point, you know, we would have put 2 and 2 together. On that same sort of vein, there were a couple of like loose ends, I guess, for lack of a better phrase. In particular, there was sort of an incident that had happened with her mother when she was a child, and that was never fully explained as like why her mother did that or what happened with that. And this isn't necessarily a con per se. I think it really hits with the whole theme of the story, but that story really made me dislike the men in power in this small town. Like, once I finished the book, I just felt an ick, such an ick. So it's not a con, it's almost a good thing that after reading this book I felt that way. That obviously speaks to the author's writing, but just prepare yourself that when you finish this book, you're gonna be like, okay, I need a break from the men in my life. Overall, I did like this book, and I would recommend this book if you are a thriller fan. The next book that I read was the Ex Hex by Erin Sterling. And this book I rate 5 stars. This book got that witchy vibe, got that sort of spooky season-esque, and essentially this book is about a witch. Her name is Vivi, and her family, they are witches, and she dates a guy. They end on not amicable terms, and when she is young and naive and heartbroken, she essentially hexes him. And later on, years later, they're both grown up, sort of how that hex plays into her life. It ends up drawing them back together. And we sort of have a little bit of like the grumpy versus sunshine dynamic. Vivi is sort of the sunshine, and Reese, the ex, is a little bit the grumpy sort of guy. They get together, and then all of this calamity happens. Every time they use magic, bad things are happening, and they're having to essentially fix all of these problems that as they go around they are creating, so then they have to go try and fix them. And it is sort of a rom-com-y story, so there is this element of like tension between them, and they used to date but they dislike each other, and a lot of it is sort of like a miscommunication piece, and then they kind of like work through that, right? So then they kind of realize like, hey, maybe I don't hate you quite as much as I thought I did. And so it's interesting to kind of see that pan out and how that sort of affects their feelings for each other, and also whether or not they can essentially fix all the problems that they created and save their town. So pros for this book was that I felt like it was super duper refreshing. When we talk about kind of like the chick lit or the rom-com-y books, I think a lot of them follow a very similar plot line, a very similar storyline. You know, we see the enemies to friends a lot, this kind of a thing. And I think sometimes that's a little bit overdone. While this book has certain elements, like I said, the grumpy versus sunshine dynamic, the enemies to friends, it's none of those sort of stereotypical plot lines I feel like are too harped on in this book. So the book itself is about a woman and kind of her journey to self-discovery as she sort of leans in a little bit to her identity as a witch, and also how she fits in with her family, how she fits in at work, and then of course how she fits in with her ex. The added element of there being magic and sort of all of these like goofy things that are happening. They release a ghost at some point. Like, that's just additional. It adds like a lot of like fun liveliness to the plot. I think also the characters were very likable. I was kind of going into this book with the understanding that it might be a little bit campy. And I mean, that's okay, there's nothing wrong with that, but sort of understanding that. And I was actually surprised at how non-campy the book was. Don't get me wrong, it's a book about witches, you know, it takes place in this little sort of Sleepy Hollow vibe town, but the characters were very well developed, and I thought that they were very spunky, they were very fun, they were very individual thinking, to the point that I was like, yeah, okay, this kind of seems like real. Like, this doesn't seem as fake and campy as I thought it would be. Another piece that I really enjoyed about this book was that there were a lot of those similar misunderstandings that, again, you see in those sort of rom-com-y books, but it wasn't dragged out. Like, if there was a miscommunication, I think a lot of times in a lot of authors will drag that out as like the whole plot line of the story. Oh, there was a miscommunication here, and therefore that is my story. It wasn't like that. If there was a miscommunication, there would be maybe a miscommunication, they'd kind of play on that for a chapter, and then it would be resolved in the next chapter. And it really kept the kind of pace of the book going quickly. It also didn't exacerbate me as the reader, because sometimes I think when you're sitting there and you're like listening to this, or you're like reading about this like really silly misunderstanding that goes on, it's kind of hard to continue to be in the book. You're like, okay, this is such a silly misunderstanding, like let's be adults and talk about this and get it over with. And sometimes that's frustrating, I think, as the reader, to like listen to like two grown adults like struggling to communicate properly or whatever. And so I think I really enjoyed that the author threw some of those road bumps in, but she didn't make that the whole plot of the story. There were other things that were going on in the story. As far as cons, I don't really have any particular cons per se. I will say that I did listen to the audiobook version of this book, and the narrator, so Rhys is supposed to be, I think he's Welsh. It's either Welsh or Irish, I'm forgetting. But basically he obviously would have a very strong accent. And the narrator of the audiobook did not have that accent, and she did not do that accent. So it was very strange sometimes. I think the rest of her narration was great, but when she particularly narrated the characters, the Welsh/Irish characters, it was a little bit cringy, so it was fine, didn't hinder the enjoyment of the book, but I actually maybe would recommend reading this book in a paper copy if that's sort of something that might get on your nerves. The next book I read is called The Daughter of Dr. Moreau by Silvia Moreno-Garcia, and this book gets 3.5 stars. So there is a film called The Island of Dr. Moreau, and it's sort of, I want to say like the 60s or something. It was a horror film, and I think that this film inspired the book. So I have not seen the film, I have heard about the film, but that's sort of the premise on which this book rests, if you will. Basically, we have a doctor, his name is Dr. Moreau, and he is sort of isolated in the, I think, the Yucatan Peninsula, and he is out there and he is essentially creating sort of like a mix of like clone, like he's like Frankensteining sort of like different sorts of living creatures, and essentially he's trying to create like a workforce of creatures that will do their master's bidding. So we have Dr. Moreau, he has a man working for him, Montgomery, and Montgomery sort of is the security guard / the overseer of the creations, we shall call them, that Dr. Moreau has created and built. And Dr. Moreau also has a daughter. And the experiments of Dr. Moreau are funded by this family called the Lazaldis, I think. I probably am saying that wrong. And they essentially fund the doctor for him to create these experiments and these creations. And ideally, they want workers for their plantation, for their haciendas. They're all living in this sort of like paradise / they're living kind of cohesively together and everything is fine. Dr. Moreau is doing his work. His daughter is growing up and just becoming this beautiful young woman. Everything's fine. Well, then the son of the like financier, Eduardo, comes to the hacienda where Dr. Moreau and his family / creations are living, and he wants to basically see what the doctor has done with his father's money. Well, here's the thing. You could call Dr. Moreau a genius, or you could call him a madman, because he's essentially created these like sentient animal beings that can talk and speak and think like humans, but they look like an alligator or like a cheetah or whatever. And so they are abominations to the outside world. And Eduardo doesn't really know what's going on. That's not like, that information isn't privy to him. So he comes in and he sees this and he's like, what's going on? And basically creates all of this chaos within their little world because the doctor needs money to continue funding his research, and Eduardo wants the clones or creations to work on the hacienda. And then also we have the daughter in here as well, who is growing up. She wants to be independent, she wants to get married, and so chaos ensues essentially. Pros for this book: I love the author's writing style. This is the second book of hers that I read. I read Mexican Gothic and I loved that. It was so deliciously creepy. If you are looking for a spooky season book, Mexican Gothic is definitely the way to go. But I really like the way that she writes. I think her writing is just truly beautiful. You can tell that she is a master of her craft. I also think the setting, beautiful, stunning. I felt like I was there, and the storyline and sort of the plot overall was interesting. I like how she took a concept, this Dr. Moreau concept, and she built that sort of almost like a fanfic. She like built it into her own story. I thought that was really cool. I thought that was really unique, and I was, yes, living for that. As far as cons for this book, the story, about like halfway, 3/4 of the way through the book, you could kind of tell what was going to happen. It was predictable. There really weren't any more twists and turns after that. I think the major twist in the book, I think we were all sort of like, yeah, of course. And so when that lack of suspense is sort of removed from the storyline, it's just not quite as like engaging of a story. So I think it was a good book, and I think I would recommend reading this book, but I would just go into it knowing that it's not going to like boom, blow you away. I think I would read this book more for like the journey that the author takes you on, the setting, getting to know the characters, and understanding that like the end of the book is a little bit like, okay. So with that being said, if you walk into this book understanding that, I think that you will enjoy this book. The last and final spooky season book that I read was The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by Sangu Mandanna. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. This book gets 3 stars. The premise of this book, we have a woman, her name is Mika. She is a witch, and she grew up very isolated. She struggles to make meaningful connections with other people because, of course, her being a witch, she can't share that with other people. And so she's sort of an isolated being, kind of craving that human connection. She posts videos of herself online doing spells. Obviously nobody realizes that they're real, of course. And she gets a call out of the blue from some people who would like her to come and teach at their sort of like private school slash like house. Essentially, come to find out that these other people are raising a group of young witches, and they need a witch to guide the young ladies in their journey to adult witchhood, essentially. So we have the caregivers of the 3 young ladies, young women, they're really children. We have the caregivers of the children, and they are human. And then we have Mika, who comes in, and she again guides them through their magical journey and learning. And we kind of, as we see this connection sort of unfold and take place, Mika begins to form relationships with the other adults in the sort of house. It's this like large mansion. And we also learn more about Mika's family and her past and kind of her as a person. The main character begins to find her place with this sort of group of oddballs, and she, I think, sort of in a way kind of builds her own home, and simultaneously she sort of makes a connection with some of her past, and she kind of works through some of those feelings. So I thought this book was like a really good kind of commentary on like being alone and trying to build a community where you can. The pros for this book, I thought it was a fun idea. Sort of the whole storyline, the plot line, the premise, it was fun, it was quirky, it was unique. I think the world building that the author does is really good in terms of like the way that she talks about like the other witches that exist in the world. Also as far as like how magic is created and the spells that they do and just different kinds of things like that. It was really fun. It was really interesting to kind of read about that. I also really liked, there was a really particular line about how being nice is different than being kind and how being nice is really being polite. You know, you see somebody and you're like, hello, how are you? That's being nice. Being kind is really caring about the other person and not just saying, oh, hi, how's it going? But really listening to what they have to say and caring about them as a human. Out of the whole book, that line really stuck with me, is that you can be nice without being kind. You can be kind without being nice. And I think that was just really an interesting thing that really stuck with me even now. My major like con for this book was that it was very fantastical. It was a little bit campy. It was very fantastical. It was very, I don't know, it just didn't feel, it felt like a fun book. You're, you know, spooky season is here. You're reading about witches, all those things. You're in this like cozy little witch vibe, and that's the book that you want to read. It didn't really feel like a book that had a lot of like intellectual merit behind it. You know, it wasn't something that you're like, wow, this could really happen in real life. It was just sort of a fun, cozy read. And I think, you know, as it gets colder and the days get shorter, that's really what we want. So I thought it was great for that. There you go. Those are all of the books that I read for my fall book themed review. I do hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider subscribing. Like I said at the beginning, we are going to be reading Christmassy books now until the end of the year. So if you have any Christmassy recommendations, sort of cozy books that you would like me to read and review, please drop them below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!